Alright, my name is Joshua Butcher. I'm a senior technical instructor here at OpenText. We're going to attempt to configure an Exchange 2010 unified messaging system to receive inbound faxes. Here's a quick checklist of the items we want to go through. We're going to configure Exchange 2010 UM for inbound faxing. We're going to do this basically by configuring the Exchange to detect CNG tones. This is going to require us to actually edit a config file. We're going to set up a dial plan, an IP gateway, and a mailbox policy. And the mailbox policy is going to have the information for Exchange to refer the information back to the gateway to be able to send it to the fax server. Obviously, then we'll need to configure a user for unified messaging. Once we're done with that, we'll need to set up Exchange for a secure connection. And we'll do this by creating a receive connector. This is going to allow the fax server to connect securely to the server so it can actually send messages to it. The next step will be to configure the OpenText fax server itself. There's some basic settings in the SR140 we'll need to set up. And the last thing we'll need to do is configure the media gateway and to work in the middle of all this to kind of make this work. Before we continue here, let's look at our actual environment. The environment I'm using right now is a audio codes MP114. Its IP address is 10.10.10.5. I have a fax machine that's directly running into this. How this is going to work is when the fax is received, the media gateway is going to send it to Exchange, which IP address is 10.10.10.10. Exchange is going to detect, first check and see if the actual extension I sent to is set up for unified communication. In this case, it'll be Jenny. And then it's going to check the policies for Jenny to see if she's allowed to do inbound faxing. If she is allowed to do inbound faxing, it's going to refer the fax information back to the actual media gateway. The media gateway will then take this information and then send it to the fax server. At this point, the whole fax communication will go across, the fax will be received, everything will be processed into the fax server and sit there. The fax server at that point will then send an SMTP message to Exchange via the secure connector that we set up, or the permissions of that. It'll send it basically a TIFF to the server, and the server will then send it to the Outlook user, and the Outlook will receive it just like they used to do in Exchange 2007. They won't see any difference on their side. Alright, our first step will be to go into Exchange 2010 and configure it to detect CNG fax tone. So I'm going to remote desktop. This is now where I'm remoted into my Exchange. And the way I do this is I need to find the config file. And it should normally be in the Program Files, Microsoft Exchange, v14, bin, and there's going to be a config file called msexchangeum.config. So I'm just going to open that up. And there's a lot in here, so I'm going to search for the word inbound. If I scroll down here, and I can look at this whole setting here, specifies whether inbound fax detection is enabled. If false, UM relies on the IP gateway to perform the action. Well, I'm going to set it to true. True, and quote, and all I have to do now is save it, close this, and in order for this setting to take place and work, I'll have to restart the actual service. So I'm going to go to services.msc, go into here and find Microsoft Exchange, stop it, the unified messaging piece, right click and start it. Okay, that should be good enough. Go back to my checklist, set up the CNG tones. I'll go ahead and mark this one off. So this is the first thing we set up, and that should get that part working. The next step will be to set up a dial plan. And so we're going to go back to Exchange again. We're going to open up the Exchange Management Console. And here we go. I'm going to go to Organizational Configuration, Unified Messaging. And now I have the Unified Messaging role enabled. You should see different tabs along the top. I'm basically going to do these first three. So first one I'm going to set up is a Unified. Now if you look on the right side here, you'll see right down the list. I'm just going to do the top three. Create a Unified Messaging Dial Plan. Now this is going to give it whatever unique name I want to call it. So this one I'll call it Dial Plan. Number of digits in the extension, I'm going to say 4. Leave the default here. I'm going to say unsecured because I'll set up my own security in a minute. Country code of 1 as I'm in the United States. New and finish. Now if I just refresh this, it should show up in our list. Maybe. There it is. So back to my checklist. Dial plan, believe it or not, is configured. Alright, next step will be to configure an UM/IP gateway. Back to Exchange. So there it is. So I'm just going to go to the next option here. New UM/IP gateway. Name, I'm just going to call it gateway. The IP address is the IP address of my MP114. So I'm going to get, that was 10.10.10.5. And I need to specify the dialing plan. And there's the one I just created. New. Finished. There it is. And you can see it automatically created a hunt group. Now I could create a new hunt group if I want to. What hunt groups basically do is they allow you, if you hit one number and it's busy, it allows you to roll to a different one. Right now it's just set for a blank identifier, which should be pretty much global. But you could specify, if I could specify a range if I wanted to. If I had, say, 5,000 to 6,000, I could just put 5,000. It's the first one on the list. I could put additional ones if I want. For the sake of what I'm doing here, I'm not going to mess with it. So IP gateway, configured. Alright, next one is one that actually takes a little more thought here. It's going to be the configure the UM mailbox policy. Now there is a default one that's already in here. I can modify that if I want to, but I'm just going to make a new one. I'm going to call it mailbox policy. I'm going to specify my new dial plan. Next. Finish. Now this one I actually had to modify, so I'm going to go to the properties of it. And you can see right away in the first tab here whether inbound faxing is enabled, and it is not by default. So I'm going to check it. Then I have to specify the information whenever this refers back to the gateway of who to send it to. So I need to type kind of what it shows here. It's going to be a SIP message. Oops. Another colon. The port I'm going to use, 5060, which is basically SIP. Equals. Now the SR140 only listens for UDP, so I need to make sure I specify UDP here. If I say TCP, it's going to send this across, but the SIP connection will not be made. That won't do me any good. So here we go. My IP address of my fax server, the port, UDP. Alright, that part is pretty much done. Now what I do need to do, and I don't think I have it on my list here, is I need to associate it now. So if I go up to, under server configuration, unified messaging, there's my server. settings, I need to add that dial plan in here. So there it is in the list. Now if I go back to the Unified Messaging tab, dial plan, see it says no associated servers. Now if I refresh that, now it shows it, and then associated gateway. So my policy is set. The last thing I need to do here is actually configure a user to actually do something. So if I didn't do this, I would send the fax across, but Unified Messaging would never be started and would never bother to look. So I'm going to go now to my mailbox. There's my user. This is RFadmin, but that's my Jenny user. So I'm going to go to right-click, Enable Unified Messaging. It's going to ask me which policy I want to use. I'm going to pick MP, the one I just made. It says you want to do a PIN. What the PIN number is for the Outlook user to be able to dial in from their desk or wherever to find out if they have any voice messages. It's not what we're doing, so automatically manually enter the extension. My extension will be 4 5s. I told it I only want 4 digits, so if I said 5 digits and only put 4, it would throw a message and be angry at me. Alright. Alright, my user is now enabled. And we'll go ahead and mark that off. And we're now ready to go and set up a secure connection piece.